Hello, I hope you don't mind me sharing something. It's something I've kept hidden for a long time, and I'd like to tell you my story. I never thought I'd find myself in this situation, and I'm still trying to understand how everything changed so quickly. It's something I've thought about for years. It was something my husband made me do that changed the course of my life. It all started a few years ago. John, my husband, and I had been married for almost 10 years, like most couples. We had our share of challenges, but I must admit, I wasn't anticipating this. John was a loving man, but over time, there was a shift in his behavior. He became more distant, more controlling, and less affectionate. I tried to overlook it, assuming it was just the stress from work, but deep down, I sensed something was amiss. One evening, John returned from work with an unusual energy about him. He seemed unusually upbeat, but there was a slightly unsettling aspect to the way he looked at me. We had dinner as usual, and just as I was about to clear the table, he asked me to sit down, and I obliged, feeling a sense of unease. His tone was serious, and I began to feel a flutter in my chest, sensing that this conversation was going to be different. I sensed that he was avoiding my gaze, and he began to speak. "I've been thinking," he said, his voice low and measured. "There's something I need to share with you." I nodded, waiting for him to continue, but the words that followed took me by surprise. He told me that he wanted to spice up our relationship, that he'd been feeling bored, and that he thought it was time we tried something different. At first, I had assumed he was suggesting a romantic getaway, or perhaps some counseling to rekindle the spark. However, I was surprised to learn that he had other ideas in mind. "I've arranged for us to meet two men," he said, "and they're coming over this weekend." I looked at him, unsure of what he was trying to convey. I wasn't sure if he was joking or if this was some sort of test, but his expression was serious. I felt a wave of nausea wash over me. "What do you mean, two men?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper. "They're friends of," he said in a casual tone, as if this were the norm. "We're going to spend the night together with them." I was taken aback. I felt a flutter in my chest as I tried to process what he was saying. This wasn't my husband. This wasn't the man I had vowed to spend my life with. He was talking about bringing two strangers into our home and into our marriage, as if it were no big deal. The thought alone made me feel uneasy, but more than that, I felt let down. How could he even suggest something like this? "John, are you sure about this?" After taking a moment to collect myself, I said, my voice barely holding together. "I'm surprised, to say the least. I don't understand why you're pushing me into this, given that it's not what we're used to. Rachel, I need you to understand that this is something I want, something we need." His tone was firm. "I love JN, but I'm struggling to see why this is happening. It feels like it could potentially damage our relationship. I'm sorry, but I can't go through with it." I had hoped that this would be the end of it, that he would see sense and abandon the idea, but I was mistaken. Over the next few days, John grew more distant. He hardly spoke to me unless it was about the plan. He started coming home late, and when I asked where he had been, he gave vague answers. Our conversations became tense, and the love that once filled our home was replaced with a suffocating silence. I felt trapped, isolated, and confused. How had I, or our marriage, come to this? By Friday, I felt a sense of foreboding. John was very insistent that the meeting was going to take place, despite my attempts to the contrary. I did consider leaving and even packed my bags, but I decided not to, although I was not fully aware of the reasons at the time. I was still somewhat attached to the man I thought I knew, and I hoped that this was just a phase, something that we could work through together. I was not yet ready to abandon our life together, but at the same time, I found the thought of going through with this plan inconsolable. Saturday evening arrived too quickly. The men, John's so-called friends, arrived promptly at 8. The friends arrived at 8:00 p.m. I was seated on the couch, my hands clenched in my lap, and I was finding it hard to hold back tears. I was not even acquainted with their names, and now they were sitting in my living room, talking to my husband, as if they were old friends. The atmosphere was somewhat tense, and I could feel their eyes on me, watching and waiting. I felt like disappearing, running out of the house and never looking back. Called friends arrived punctually at 8 p.m. I sat on the couch, my hands clenched in my lap, trying to hold back tears. I didn't even know their names, and now they were sitting in my living room, talking to my husband as if they were old friends. The air was thick with tension, and I could feel their eyes on me, watching, waiting. I wanted to disappear, to run out of the house, and never look back. But then John leaned over to me, his hand resting on my knee. "Rachel, it's time," he whispered. I froze, my mind screaming at me to get up and leave, but my body refused to move. John's hand felt like a weight on my knee, anchoring me in place. I couldn't look at him, and I certainly couldn't look at the two men sitting across from me. My heart pounded. John leaned over to me, his hand resting on my knee. "It's time," he whispered. I felt frozen, as if my body would not move. I felt as if my mind was screaming at me to get up and leave, but my body refused to move. John's hand felt like a weight on my knee, anchoring me in place. I felt unable to look at him, or at the two men sitting opposite me. My heart pounded in my chest, and the room seemed to close in around me. "Rachel, please," John said again, his voice lower now, almost pleading. There was something in his tone that made me pause. It wasn't just insistence, it was desperation. For the first time in days, I saw a flicker of vulnerability in his eyes. This wasn't just about satisfying some twisted fantasy I felt a sense of unease, as if something was wrong, but I couldn't quite put my finger on it. In that moment, I felt a sense of guilt, as if I was the one who was responsible for what was happening. I felt a sense of guilt, as if I was the one who was responsible for what was happening. I felt a sense of guilt, as if I was the one who was responsible for what was happening. "I'm doing this for us, Rachel, don't you see?" "No, you don't," I retorted, finding a sliver of strength. "You're doing this for yourself. You've changed, John. This isn't about us anymore. It's about control." For a moment, I thought I saw a hint of guilt flash across his face, but it was gone as quickly as it came. Instead, he clenched his jaw and stood up, pacing the room. "I'm doing this for us, Rachel, don't you see?" "No, you don't," I replied, finding a sliver of strength. "You're doing this for yourself. You've changed, John. This isn't about us anymore. It's about control." For a moment, I thought I saw a hint of guilt on his face, but it was gone as quickly as it came. Instead, he clenched his jaw and stood up, pacing the room like a man who had lost his way. I wanted to reach out to him to pull him back to the man I once knew, but I wasn't sure how. We were so far from where we had started, and I wasn't sure if we could ever find our way back. As the silence stretched between us, one of the men, let's call him Marcus, cleared his throat. He seemed to sense the tension, but I felt somewhat disoriented, as if I were a man who had lost his way. I longed to reach out and guide him back to the person I once knew, but I was uncertain how. We had strayed so far from our initial path, and I was unsure if we could ever find our way back. As the silence between us stretched, one of the men, let's refer to him as Marcus, cleared his throat. He appeared to sense the tension in the air, and his voice, calm but firm, broke the silence. "If this isn't happening, we should probably leave," he said. I glanced up at him, and for the first time, I truly observed him. He wasn't what I had expected. He was calm, respectful, and his demeanor seemed more sympathetic than I had anticipated. I had formed this idea in my mind. There was a sense of urgency in his demeanor. He spoke calmly but firmly, saying, "If this isn't happening, it would be best to leave." I looked up at him, and for the first time, I really observed him. He wasn't what I had anticipated. He was calm, respectful, and his demeanor seemed more empathetic than I had anticipated. I had formed this idea in my mind that these men were predators, but they weren't. They were just people, and this made the whole situation even more perplexing. I didn't want to stay, I didn't want to be part of whatever this was becoming. However, the weight of everything, the years with John, the love we once shared, and the hope that maybe, somehow, things could return to normal, I found myself at a loss as to how to proceed. I felt overwhelmed by my own indecision. Then John spoke. His voice was quiet but resolute. "Rachel, if you leave, we're done." Those words struck me like a punch to the gut. I looked at him, unable to comprehend what he had just said. He had drawn a line in the sand, and I had to choose which side I was on. I found myself in an unenviable position, unable to decide how to proceed. John's quiet but firm words, "Rachel, if you leave, we're done," struck me like a bolt from the blue. I looked at him, taken aback, trying to understand his meaning. He had drawn a line in the sand, and I had to choose which side I was going to stand on. Tears welled up in my eyes, but I blinked them back, determined not to let him see me break. "I've given you everything," he continued, his voice steady but cold. "I've provided for you, loved you, and this is all I'm asking for in return." I stood up, my legs shaky but determined. "This isn't love, John," I said, my voice cracking. My voice was barely above a whisper as I continued, "This is manipulation." His eyes flashed with anger, but I felt indifferent. I could not, nor would I, do this. I turned towards the door, fully expecting him to yell, grab me, or try and stop me, but he did not. Instead, I heard him mutter under his breath, something like, "You'll regret this." Perhaps leaving was a mistake. Mistake was all I could hear him mutter, but in that moment, I knew I had to walk away. I couldn't let JN or anyone force me into something I wasn't comfortable with. As I stepped outside, the cool evening air hit my face, and I felt a strange mixture of relief and heartbreak. My legs carried me down the street, my mind racing. Where would I go? What would I do? I had no answers, only a sense of uncertainty about the future. I made a mistake, but in that moment I knew I had to take a step back. I couldn't let JN or anyone else force me into something that I wasn't comfortable with. As I stepped outside, the cool evening air hit my face, and I felt a strange mixture of relief and heartbreak. My legs carried me down the street, my mind racing with thoughts of where I should go, what I should do. I had no answers, only a deep sense of betrayal and loss. I wandered for what felt like hours before I found myself standing in front of my best friend, Sarah's house. I knocked on the door, praying she was home. When she opened the door and saw my tear-streaked face, she didn't ask any questions. She just pulled me into a tight hug and led me inside. Over the next few days, I felt a sense of profound loss and betrayal. After some time, I found myself standing in front of my best friend Sarah's house. I knocked on the door, hoping she was home. When she opened the door and saw my tear-stained face, she didn't ask any questions. Instead, she gave me a warm hug and led me inside. Over the next few days, I stayed with Sarah as she tried to process everything that had happened. I felt a sense of emptiness, as if a part of me had been torn away. I missed John, but I also knew I couldn't go back. The damage had been done, and there was no repairing what was broken. John tried calling me a few times, leaving voicemails that ranged from apologetic to angry. He was all over the place, and I was finding it difficult to cope with the emotions he was experiencing, and I decided not to respond to his calls. After a while, he stopped trying. Over time, I began to rebuild my life. I decided to file for divorce because I knew our marriage was beyond saving. It was the hardest decision I had ever made, but in the end, I felt it was the right one. I couldn't stay in a relationship. I felt as though I was being taken advantage of and forced into situations that went against my principles. I am grateful for the lessons I have learned, and I am working on allowing myself to trust and respect again.